In the gray pre-dawn mist east of Amiens, the ground itself seemed to breathe. Beneath the churned mud and shattered wire, miles of tunnels lay hidden, built not by miners in peacetime shafts, but by soldiers who called themselves the moles. They belonged to one of the British Army's most secret organizations, the tunneling companies of the Royal Engineers. Their work was never meant to be seen, only felt. In the sudden collapse of a German trench, the deafening roar of an underground mine, or the silent appearance of a new passage where none existed the night before. On that morning, the first day of the Battle of Amiens, the British Fourth Army launched what would later be called the opening blow of the 100 Days Offensive, the campaign that finally broke the German lines and ended 4 years of trench stalemate. Yet behind the thunder of tanks and the coordinated advance of infantry and aircraft, a quieter force had already tilted the odds. Weeks earlier, British tunnelers had transformed the earth beneath Amiens into a weapon. They dug observation posts, ammunition chambers, signal galleries, and deep dugouts shielded from the worst shelling. Some shafts crept dangerously close to the German front, allowing engineers to plant explosives under key machine gun nests. Others served as covered approaches, letting assault units mass unseen until the moment of attack. The idea was not new. Britain's underground war had begun back in 1915, when German miners first exploded charges beneath Allied lines at St. Eloi and Ypres. The response from London had been swift. Recruit coal miners, sewer workers, and engineers, men used to darkness, danger, and silence. By 1918, these hush-hush tunneling companies had become specialists in both offense and defense. But at Amiens, their purpose changed. Instead of seeking to destroy trenches from below, they used their knowledge of geology and drainage to stabilize ground for tanks, secure supply routes through chalk and clay, and create deceptive networks that fooled German reconnaissance. Every shaft was mapped by candlelight. Air vents were disguised under shell craters. Communication lines were buried to survive bombardment. Few of the infantry who stormed across no man's land that August morning ever knew how much depended on the unseen men below their boots. They didn't see the cramped galleries or hear the constant dripping of groundwater. But when they reached the enemy lines intact and unshelled, the credit belonged partly to the tunnelers who had turned the earth itself into Britain's first layer of armor. The success at Amiens didn't begin with the infantry's advance. It began weeks earlier, with picks and shovels striking chalk beneath the Somme Valley. The tunneling corps worked in secrecy under the cover of night, hauling out tons of earth by hand and marking their routes on rough sketches that only engineers could decipher. No headlines mentioned them. No marching bands celebrated their arrival. Yet without them, the ambitious Allied plan, combining tanks, aircraft, artillery, and infantry in one synchronized assault, could never have worked. The British knew that surprise would be their greatest weapon. Since the Germans had strong positions along the Somme, any sign of preparation could have ruined the operation. The tunnelers' job was to make that preparation invisible. They connected old chalk quarries with new galleries, carving out routes wide enough to move men, guns, and supplies under cover. They reinforced those galleries with timber frames scavenged from ruined villages and lined the walls with duckboards to keep out the seepage from underground springs. Some shafts were so deep that air had to be pumped down manually. Others ran just beneath the surface, close enough that enemy sentries could be heard coughing above. Working in darkness demanded a kind of discipline few soldiers ever experienced. Talking was limited to whispers, tools were wrapped in cloth to muffle sound, and lanterns were dimmed to pinpoints of yellow light. German counterminers often dug their own galleries to intercept British shafts, setting off small charges or listening with stethoscopes pressed against the earth. One misjudged stroke of a pick could invite disaster. But by 1918, the British engineers had learned to listen as well as dig. They used geophones, early acoustic detectors, to locate enemy tunnels and avoid them entirely. Every foot of progress was measured in inches of silence. By late July, entire networks crisscrossed the Allied front near Amiens. Some served as assembly areas for tanks of the Royal Armored Corps, others as ammunition depots buried safely beneath layers of clay. The tunnelers even experimented with acoustic deception, burying hollow pipes and boards that, when struck, mimicked the sound of heavy machinery, drawing German artillery fire away from real positions. When General Rawlinson's staff finalized the plan for August 8, They noted that much of the logistical groundwork, routes for cables, storage for shells, and stable soil for tank crossings, was already complete thanks to the underground companies. Few of those men would ever see the battlefield they helped shape. Most were transferred or reassigned before the first tank rolled forward. But the foundations they left behind held firm when the offensive began, allowing the greatest combined arms attack of the war to move with astonishing speed. Above them, the surface erupted in thunder. Below, their silent handiwork remained unseen. Proof that victory at Amiens had been prepared not just by generals, but by miners who waged war with patience and precision instead of rifles. When dawn broke over the Amiens front on August 8, 1918, a thick morning fog rolled across the fields, swallowing the horizon in a pale haze. From the German trenches, it seemed like another quiet hour before the shelling resumed. But hidden beneath that fog, and beneath the very soil, Britain's preparations were already set in motion. The tunneling corps' work had made the battlefield deceptive. Dugouts and supply lines ran unseen, while engineers had charted solid paths for hundreds of tanks that would lead the assault. When the first guns opened at 4:20 a.m., the ground shook with a violence that seemed to come from below as much as above. German troops later reported hearing strange, muffled detonations under their positions, localized blasts that collapsed machine gun posts and communication trenches. These were the last of the mines laid by British engineers in the weeks before the attack, timed to coincide with the creeping barrage that marched ahead of the infantry. Though smaller than the massive mines of Messines 2 years earlier, they had a precise purpose: to tear open specific points of resistance, leaving gaps for advancing units. The coordination was astonishing: artillery, armor, and underground demolition all synchronized by signal lines buried and shielded by the tunnelers themselves. As the fog thickened, British and Canadian troops surged forward almost unopposed. German artillery was slow to respond, its phone lines severed, many of its observation posts collapsed or abandoned. Under the protection of the underground cables, British commanders received updates in real time, adjusting their barrage with remarkable accuracy. The terrain, once thought impossible for tanks due to deep chalk beds and unstable ridges, held firm. That stability was no accident. In the preceding nights, tunneling officers had reinforced several tank routes with timber and sandbag layers, preventing the heavy Mark V machines from sinking into the sodden ground. By mid-morning, whole sections of the German front had folded. Prisoners emerged dazed, describing how trenches broke apart beneath them. While much of that was due to shellfire, the psychological impact was compounded by the knowledge that the enemy had been beneath their feet all along. For years, the Germans had prided themselves on their deep bunkers and defensive engineering, but at Amiens those strengths became weaknesses. The British tunnelers had reversed the geometry of the battlefield, turning the ground itself into a weapon of concealment and control. News of the day's advance astonished headquarters. In less than 24 hours, the Allies had pushed 8 miles, an unimaginable distance in trench warfare. But for the men underground, victory came with little celebration. Their work was already shifting. As the front lines moved east, tunneling companies followed, extending communication trenches, building shelters for command posts, and preparing casualty evacuation tunnels. They emerged only at night, their faces pale from the dark, their uniforms stained with chalk and oil. Above them, the guns thundered on. Below, they dug for tomorrow's safety as the front advanced beyond Amiens. The tunneling corps faced a paradox they had never encountered before. For nearly 4 years, their war had been static, measured in feet of progress beneath the earth. But after August 8th, the front no longer stood still. The German lines, once thought unbreakable, were retreating. The British and Dominion forces were pressing forward faster than the engineers could map the new terrain. Suddenly, the underground specialists who had once operated behind fixed sectors were being asked to keep pace with a war in motion. In the first 48 hours after the breakthrough, new priorities emerged. Abandoned German dugouts had to be inspected and cleared. Many were booby-trapped or flooded. Others contained stores of gas shells or explosives that could easily detonate if handled carelessly. Tunneling officers moved in behind the infantry, marking safe routes and wiring off unstable sections. They also converted captured positions into forward shelters, installing reinforced roofs of steel, and timber to protect against counter-bombardments. In one sector near Villers-Bretonneux, a team of Australian tunnellers turned a collapsed German shaft into a working command post within a single night, a feat of improvisation that allowed communications to resume hours ahead of schedule. But the greatest challenge came from the earth itself. The Somme basin was a patchwork of chalk ridges and clay valleys. In heavy rain, the upper soil became liquid, swallowing tools, rails, even entire supply carts. To keep the advance supplied, the tunnellers laid temporary underground storage chambers for artillery shells and machine gun ammunition. They also carved out emergency medical shelters where wounded men could receive treatment below the line of fire. These were crude, airless spaces lit by a single candle or a carbide lamp, but to the men who stumbled into them bleeding and exhausted, they were as valuable as any fortress. German counterminers, once a constant threat, were now falling back too quickly to mount serious resistance. Still, the tunnellers kept listening. They carried portable geophones in their kit, lowering the devices into fresh soil to detect any faint vibrations that might betray a hidden enemy. More often, what they heard were echoes of artillery and the rumble of advancing tanks. The underground war that had once defined the Western Front was ending, but it had not yet finished shaping it. The experience of the tunneling companies was now being used for something larger: the creation of vast networks of supply depots and communication lines that could sustain a modern mechanized offensive. By mid-August, the British Fourth Army had advanced over 15 miles, supported by an unseen web of tunnels, storage chambers, and reinforced dugouts. Each success above ground depended on hours of work below. Even when the guns fell silent at night, the sound of spades and picks carried faintly through the trenches. The men who dug there would never appear in the headlines, yet their quiet labor ensured that the miracle of Amiens did not collapse under its own weight. The hush-hush engineers had become the backbone of Britain's moving front, invisible, tireless, and indispensable. By the end of August 1918, the thunder at Amiens had faded eastward. The offensive had broken the German line so decisively that General Ludendorff would later call it the Black Day of the German Army. Yet for the British Tunneling Corps, the end of the battle brought no celebration, only more work. Their galleries had to be sealed or adapted, maps updated, and unexploded charges neutralized before civilians could ever return. They emerged from the earth pale, blinking against the sun, looking more like miners returning from a long shift than soldiers who had helped win one of the most decisive victories of the war. When the infantry pushed forward toward the Somme crossings and the Hindenburg Line, the tunnellers followed, establishing new underground routes for telegraph cables and ammunition dumps. They had become an invisible infrastructure team, the engineers behind the fluid warfare that marked the war's final 100 days. Where once they had dug to destroy, now they dug to build. They repaired cratered roads, braced unstable bridges, and even installed ventilation in captured bunkers to make them habitable for command posts. Their work no longer sought to collapse German trenches, but to sustain the relentless pace of Allied advance. The Battle of Amiens marked the moment when the underground war met the modern one. Tanks, aircraft, and radio had reshaped combat, but they all relied on the hidden foundations laid by men with shovels and compasses. The Tunneling Corps had made that possible. Their precise mapping of the soil, their mastery of drainage and concealment, had created the stable platform on which the offensive could unfold. When Amiens fell, it did so because the ground itself had been prepared for months to hold the weight of a new kind of war, one that moved, adapted, and learned from every foot of chalk and clay carved open since 1915. In the years that followed, most of those men returned to the mines, railways, and quarries they had left behind. Few ever spoke about their wartime service. Official records listed their companies by number, not name. Medals were rare and recognition even rarer. Yet the lessons they left behind transformed military engineering. Between the wars, their maps and notebooks became the foundation for modern tunneling safety codes, civil defense shelters, and underground transport design. In secret, they had shaped both victory and the world that came after it. When historians describe the Battle of Amiens, they often speak of tanks breaking through fog, or cavalry advancing where none thought possible. But beneath every charge and every barrage lay the invisible geometry of the Tunneling Corps, the men who turned the soil of France into a weapon and a shield. They fought not with rifles, but with patience, silence, and the unshakable knowledge that sometimes the most decisive battles are waged out of sight. Beneath the shattered ridges and the open fields of Amiens, the echoes of their work still remain, a buried monument to Britain's hush-hush army that helped turn the tide of the Great War. In the end, the tunneling corps never marched in parades or posed for triumphant photographs. Their war was waged in darkness, their victories buried beneath the surface. But without them, the Battle of Amiens might have been just another bloody stalemate on the Western Front. Instead, it became the turning point that ended the Great War. Every mile gained in daylight was earned first in silence underground, by men whose courage was measured not in medals, but in the steady rhythm of a pick striking chalk. Their story remains one of Britain's most remarkable wartime achievements. Unseen, unsung, and unforgettable. If you enjoyed uncovering the hidden side of history, make sure to subscribe for more stories of forgotten ingenuity and courage from the world's darkest wars. Like, share. Let me know in the comments. Where in the world are you watching from? I always love seeing the global community gather around these stories.